So a quick plug for my book, which came out a couple of years ago. It doesn't have an American publisher at the moment, but it's, I believe you can order it from the UK publisher, which is called Pavilion. But if you're interested in looking at what I'm talking about further, there's quite a lot in what I'm going to talk about which complements the last two speakers, I would say. Then, especially the last talk, I was flapping furiously at the back there. So I'll try and highlight some of the complementary bits rather than going over the same things. I'm diagnosed autistic, diagnosis of Asperger's 10 years ago. This was following my son's diagnosis a few years earlier. My son was diagnosed at the age of 2, and I was diagnosed at the age of 36, so a bit of a gap there. My son's now 16 years old and is taller than me. He's also would be classified as having severe learning or intellectual disability. So kind of quite different in many ways, my son and I, but in many ways quite similar as well. This is me many years ago coming down a slide before the UK brought in tighter health and safety regulations. And number of roles I do, so I'm very busy at the moment. Throughout history and philosophy, so I was waving at the Wittgenstein reference there, from Plato through Hobbes to recent politics, there's always been this dominance of what is normal in a society and sanctions and stigma for those who deviate away from it. And as Donna Williams said, from its outset, from when autism was first defined, it's been judged by outsiders by its appearances rather than the lived experience of autism. So I'm going to talk a bit about alternative theories of autistic experience, about social relationality and social othering, and some of the implications for practice of what I'm going to talk about. So to start off with, here's an old quote from Hans Asperger. And this is not one of his better moments. And he says, "The autist is only himself and is not an active member of a greater organism which he is influenced by and which he influences constantly." He's basically saying that autistic people are not part of society, not full social members. As an autistic sociologist, I find this a bit odd. And the ontological status of autism, or more bluntly, what is autism, is somewhat dominated, or has been, especially in practice textbooks and so on, by three dominant theories: theory of mind, executive dysfunction, and weak central coherence theory. And I know that I saw an article recently which had a look at lots of differing theories which are coming out. Some of them I'd prefer over others, no doubt. But these dominant theories position autism as a neurological disorder, a pathological deviance from expected functional stages of development, as deviance away from normalcy. And this approach, when applied to the education or care of those diagnosed, often becomes a treatment program to try and modify the autistic person or the way they're behaving or acting to best fit into mainstream culture and society. This quote here is something I wrote now 20 years ago, and 10 years before I was diagnosed as autistic. This is before I had a very good idea of what autism was at all. Extremes of any combination come to be seen as psychiatric deviance, and the argument presented here, where disorder begins, is entirely down to social convention, and where one decides to draw the line across the spectrum. So I was even using the word spectrum back then, but I had the rather long academic mouthful of the human spectrum of dispositional diversity. So I was nearly there with the neurodiversity. And one of the theories I'd like to talk about is what's called an interest model of autism, or monotropism, as it was first called. And this was developed by some friends and colleagues of mine, Dr. Donna Murray, and then later Wen Lawson. And this sees attention as a scarce resource for all human beings. And a monotropic attention strategy is when you hone down and focus in and try and, or block out external stuff somewhat to that attention tunnel. And there's an interesting link between ideas of this interest model of monotropism and how it makes repetitive behaviours and interests more meaningful and coherent to outsiders, and how it links to the concept of flow states. So what's a flow state? Well, you've heard the terms going with the flow or being in the zone, some sports people talk about, as a form of optimal experience that can be beneficial to feelings of happiness and well-being, described as being so involved in an activity that nothing else seems to matter. So you can lose sense of self, sense of time, sense of other things happening. So being so involved that nothing else matters much. Flow experiences require then complete immersion in an activity, whether playing a musical instrument, completing a complex technical task, or reading a book. And it can happen with social interactions as well, say when one is talking to a good friend. And activities that lead to a flow experience can be called autotelic, in the sense that they are an end in themselves. It's not being done for some end reward or outcome. It's the activity itself which is rewarding, which produces the flow-like state. So people on the autism spectrum are often said to be tuned out from the social world operating around them. To me, this is a large, or sometimes at least, a large mischaracterization. At times it's because the individual in question is fully engaged in a given activity and could be said to have achieved a state of flow. It's just something an outsider may not be recognizing or connecting to. As Donna Murray once said, we suggest that the uneven skills profile in autism depends on which interests have been fired into monotropic superdrive and which have been left unstimulated by any felt experience, or worse still, negative experience. And experiences of failure or the condemnation or mocking of others can have devastating consequences. This can be highly influential on which interests are taken up and followed through, and which are stopped through feelings of fear and anxiety. Disruptions to this flow can lead to a fragmented perception of incoming stimuli, feelings of an unwanted invasion, and this can lead to reactions called meltdowns, shutdowns, panic attacks, and so on. This photograph of me here was when I was a small child, and I was on a seesaw in the park. And previous to this picture, there's a picture of me looking very happy on the end of this seesaw. What led to this panic attack was my brother went to the back of it at the other end and started moving it up and down. So I got a bit discombobulated, couldn't predict the sensory change that was about to happen. So I went into an instant panic attack, and my mother took a photograph. So. I love my mum because she's brilliant. But. So, I'm going to show you a case in point. Is my main interest, other than philosophy and sociology and so on, is table tennis. And this is extremely good for producing flow-like states, just bouncing a ball up and down. This doesn't take all my attention though. I can carry on talking to you because it's become largely automated. And I've been doing this since I was a young child, so I can spin the ball, bounce it up, and do whatever I really like and carry on. There we go. So, bit of showing off there. But I've been playing this sport from a young age, and there was a quote from an old school teacher of mine who said that he was also my French teacher, but he took the table tennis club. And when I was a young child, he wrote in my school report that appalling I fear, I'm at a loss to know what to do next. Fortunately, he enjoys his table tennis. So I got completely failed French exam, and I'm absolutely terrible at French. But I carried on, and a few years back got to 350th in England, which for an autistic dyspraxic guy is not bad. So moving on, these quotes here are all from autistic young people, mainly in mainstream educational settings or attached units. More verbal autistic youngsters. And this came from a study I was involved in some years ago, in 2012. 95% of people don't understand me. Friends are overwhelming. Adults never leave me alone. And most worrying of the quotes we had was, adults don't stop bullying me. And if you think of these quotes, they're all showing social awareness, social understanding, a sense of me, self and other and difference. Quite a social understanding going on. So what I suggested with the double empathy problem was basically an academic way of framing something that autistic people have been writing about since the early 90s, from what I've seen. In this case of mutual incomprehension that can happen between autistic and non-autistic people. And as a theory, it sees this breakdown in interaction as not solely located in the mind of the autistic person, but from the two differing dispositions trying to interact with one another in situ. Very much like the last presenter was talking about this embodied way of being and how that connects with others. And the double empathy problem is when that breaks down or it goes really wrong, if you like. And theory of autistic mind, if you like, can often leave a great deal to be desired, especially in, say, a practitioner who's never met an autistic person knowingly before or interacted with them. British academic Lynne Cameron came up with a term, or uses the term dyspathy, to highlight how empathy is often blocked or resisted by people. So she was trying to find a term other than apathy and antipathy to try and get to this thing of not being empathetic all the time. Such research supports the earlier social psychological theories of Henry Tajfel, who found that people felt increasing emotional connection to those deemed within their social in-group, while stereotyping and excluding outsiders. And this quote was from Lynne Cameron, and I thought it was a rather interesting one. If we were to be continually tuning into other people's emotions, we would be perpetually anxious or exhilarated and very quickly exhausted. We must therefore have very efficient inhibitory mechanisms that screen out most of the emotional empathy being carried out by our brains without us even noticing. She wasn't talking about autistic people there. She was just talking generally. There's an earlier one from me. It's argued here that empathy is a convenient illusion, and the phenomenon that people speak of when referring to it has more to do with language and a sense of shared cultural meanings and symbols. I could have put up a photograph of Ludwig Wittgenstein. With autistic people, especially those who acquire verbal articulacy, one often finds the sociality of an outsider, someone not in the mainstream culture or rebelling against it potentially. And it's often said that one of the most defining features of autism is a spiky, uneven set of abilities and cognitive profile, with extreme strengths in some areas and difficulties in others. But such a sociality is then stigmatized rather than seen as a potential asset within communities of practice. But we're creating communities of our own. As Ian Hacking, the philosopher, said, autistic people are creating the language in which to describe the experience of autism, and hence helping to forge the concepts in which to think about it. A sociologist I use in some of my writing, a guy called Harry Collins, points out in his writing that animals, domesticated animals, do not have the same sociality as human beings. And when he just was talking about machines, people, animals, and consciousness and stuff like that. Whilst immersed in human society, they're not able to be fully socialized in the sense one does not encounter vegetarian, arty, or nerdy dogs. They're simply just dogs. Yet a quite obvious one when looking at the sociality of autistic people is you find plenty of vegetarian, artistic, and certainly nerdy autistic people. So with our distinct interests and abilities, these involve social practices. And this includes those who are deemed non-verbal, who are often musical or artistic, or whose bodily movements, it's been argued, are a form of language themselves. But Harry Collins had a warning. The individual is a temporary and leaky repository of collective knowledge, kept apart from society for any length of time, and the context sensitivity and currency of the individual's abilities will fade. So perhaps some of the problems autistic people are facing is because of social isolation. So what he's arguing here is social isolation itself can lead to problems with sensitivity to context or the currency in one's abilities and making use out of them in a social setting. However, much social skill or behavioural training that autistic people put through is predicated upon the breaking down of social information. Make it more explicit. Autistic people like clarity, structure, predictability. Problem with that is social reality is very flexible, highly quick changing reality. So it doesn't really help you learn how to navigate it very well. Recently, however, though, methods such as intensive interaction, other intervention studies and so on, have looked more at the relationship building and child-led activities and begun to challenge this dominance in the field. So how one perceives autism naturally leads to a perception of what is considered best for regard to service provision. The window of opportunity discourse has produced an ever-growing range of early interventions, stuff to do something about it early on. It's interesting to note, though, that this is a time where autistic people have very little say in the matter. So if you're a 2-year-old with no speech. And what are optimal outcomes? Much research would seem to define that as being normal or having normal, as close to normal development, normal functioning, and so on. This communication page was put together by the activist Mel Baggs to deal with a particular support worker that they were having difficulty with. Quite an ingenious one with a voice output, so you could do sort of, please leave me alone now, and then ramp it up if things got out of hand to the top right-hand corner. Great stuff. But it's a serious point. This is a quote from Donna Williams from 1996. I had virtually no socially shared nor consciously intentionally expressed personhood beyond this performance of a non-autistic normality, with which I had neither comprehension, connection, nor identification. This disconnected, constructed facade was accepted by the world around me, where my true and connected self was not. Each spoonful of its acceptance was a shovelful of dirt on the coffin in which my real self was being buried alive. A rather eloquent account of masking there from Donna. And this does lead to theories around social isolation and suicide. The very earliest days of sociology, Emile Durkheim, the French sociologist, did a study of suicide across Europe because he saw it as a topic which was traditionally seen as very individualized and psychologized about the person and their thoughts. So he tried to put suicide in a social context, and this was published in 1897, so quite a while ago. And he suggested there was a personal need for equilibrium, with too little or too much of rapid change or too little change in society, or too much isolation or being too controlled by a society or group you're in, can lead to problems and eventually a higher suicide rate. Thus, people were seen in need of a level of social control and sanction, in his view, for their own good and for the good of society. There's a bit of a problem, though, in that idea. Is as if everyone's starting point is the same. So if your natural thing on this graph is off-center, someone trying to move you towards it is going to put you into these very difficult situations, thinking it's in your best interest to normalize you when actually they're making things worse. And this links to another sociologist, Parsons, who saw illness and disability as a form of social deviance from functional norms which needed professional monitoring and surveillance. So hence the sick notes for work and getting out of work detail, as it were, from being ill. This was later developed into what was called the rehabilitation role for those who had seen as more long-term problems or couldn't get better. The idea there was to make people as normal as possible. But this normalization agenda has had a significant impact on autistic people. There's cultural imperialism in the sense that how we are defined as autistic people traditionally has not been done by autistic people themselves in a powerful sense, in owning the narrative culturally. And notions such as ableism and mansplaining can be seen as having similar roots. And a few years ago I used a variation of mansplaining about psychological and psychiatric professions who often reduce relationships to that of the sick role and remedial attempts, with one's interpretations of oneself undermined by the expert knowledge being projected onto you, who by default is positioned in oneself is positioned relatively powerless in comparison to the medical practitioner. Some disability researchers, Carol Thomas and Donna Williams, use this term psychoemotional disablement. And the idea here, it's similar to old labelling theory in some respects, but takes it further, that society disables people on a psychological and emotional level. So, through various means. And this leads to why people often follow more of a social model approach. This is a quote from Michelin Mason. Because most of us are not ill at all, but have injuries or genetic conditions of a permanent nature, the goal of getting better is impossible to achieve. But changing the way we are treated as disabled people is possible. Therefore, the social model is full of hope for us. And some quotes to conclude. Jim Sinclair, grant me the dignity of meeting me on my own terms. Recognise that we're equally alien to each other, the double empathy problem there. That my ways of being are not merely damaged versions of yours. This one here was from a magazine that's run in the UK, which someone sent in. And this is to end on a bit of a more positive note. When I'm in an environment I feel comfortable in, with people who are kind and tolerant and doing things I enjoy, then I'm as happy as the next person. It's when people tell me I should think, speak, or behave differently that I start to feel different, upset, isolated, and worthless. So surely the problem is a lack of fit with the environment rather than something inside my brain that needs to be fixed. And lastly, an old quote of my own, it is the personal tragedy model and resultant normalisation agenda, supported by some of the world's largest autism charities, and with the resultant need induced in parents of autistic people to behaviourally modify them, that has done most or a lot of the disabling of autistic people living in society today, many of whom remain undetected by those who would potentially provide them with more positive support. What I was getting at there was each other, the autistic community. So I'd like to end on that point.
The UC Davis Mind Institute was created in 1998 with a promise to find cures for neurodevelopmental disorders. Every day, our physicians and researchers come closer to fulfilling that promise. Their groundbreaking research on autism, Fragile X syndrome, chromosome 22q11.2 deletion syndrome, ADHD, and other brain disorders are helping children achieve their fullest potential. Please visit our website to find out more about current studies, upcoming events, and how you can help make a difference.